Okay, yeah, it's good to be here. Good to see a lot of people in the room. So yeah, I'm speaking on what will socialism look like. I'd like first to understand what socialism will look like. I think we have to go through just a few things about capitalism, a few problems with capitalism that you're probably all aware of. That's probably why you're here. But then I think that helps us get into how socialism can help solve these problems. So first things first, something that I think we've all come to know, we all feel it in the wallet when we go to the grocery store or buy anything really, inflation. So inflation hit an all-time high last summer at 8.1%, but this was just an average. Actually food stuff, basic food stuff that you can't not buy it basically, is around double that. So basically what this means is it's cutting into the disposable income, particularly of poor working class families that are being pushed to the brink. And we're seeing this because on the poor end of the spectrum, poor working class families making under $60,000 a year have said that they're eating 30% less food. This is in Canada, one of the best. This is the best that capitalism can offer. People are eating less because they can't afford it. Food banks, the use of food banks has exploded. A few years ago, the use of food banks, there was 2.2 million Canadians per month that used food banks, which is a lot, by the way, if you don't notice. Last year, this shot up to 5.1 million per month using food banks. This year, last year, it exceeded 8.2 million Canadians a month using food bank. That's a very significant portion of the population that's had to resort to food banks because of the current crisis of the system. I would argue, now this might shock some of you. I think if you are surprised by that number, these numbers that I said, I think you should think about what capitalism actually is and what it means to have a society organized around profit and private ownership of the means of production, and then come to the realization that that's actually not shocking. That's perfectly normal, these types of things in a system that is organized in this way. So what you see is rising inequality, extreme impoverishment on one end, represented by some of the numbers I've already stated, while on the other end you have massive increasing wealth. This is capitalism. Another example of this is last year, household wealth, so the wealth basically of working class families, mostly working class families, fell by nearly 1 trillion. You know how much a trillion is. That's a lot. That's 1,000 billion. So households now have $1.85 in debt for every dollar that they bring in income. Think about that. That means that working class families are essentially, and that's the highest it's been in, I think, ever actually, working class families are drowning in debt. Yes, so we're seeing these extremes on the really far end of this, homelessness. We've probably all seen this. There's in every major city in the country, there's an explosion of tent cities. And how are governments dealing with this? They're there to help, aren't they, governments? Violent evictions, while not providing places for these people to live. Yes, and homelessness has exploded because, as I said, this system is pushing an increasing number of people to the brink, being unable to cope. And I believe this is essentially a death sentence. Maybe not right away, but eventually. This is something that Friedrich Engels called social murder. Is there a capitalist that is putting a gun to a homeless person's head and pulling the trigger? No, but they are creating the conditions in which homeless people are dying. And yes, indeed, just talking about Toronto, last year, one homeless person died every 2 days. Again, think about this. This shouldn't be surprising. This is capitalism. There are more than enough homes, but then you have people dying of homelessness, basically. At the same time, I mentioned this rising inequality. So this wouldn't be so bad if everyone was suffering. But that's not the case now, is it? Indeed, during the pandemic, the wealth of the billionaires in Canada grew by 57%. Did wages go up by 57%? No, clearly not. I think all of us would have, any of us who work jobs here would like to have had a raise of 57%. For the 41 richest billionaires in Canada own as much as the bottom 40%. That's just 41 individuals own as much as the bottom of the 40%. Many of them who are now using food banks and can barely get enough to eat. Again, this should not be surprising. This is capitalism. Moving on, the environmental crisis. So many people consider this the most important crisis. This is a burning situation, a burning crisis. And again, I would argue this shouldn't be surprising. We've known about this. There's been a scientific consensus for a long time, and I believe there's been a consensus of the majority of the population of the world for a long time that there is a climate crisis, and that not only that there is a crisis, but that we must do something about it. Again, should we be surprised? I again think no. Capitalism is a system that produces for profit with no regard for the environment. And we are seeing the effects of this now more clearly than ever. Last summer, you had a heat wave in Europe. Just in the UK alone, 1,000 people were killed, died from the heat wave. You've probably seen pictures on social media, major rivers drying up. 1/3 of Pakistan flooded, killing thousands, displacing millions. And this isn't sometimes we talk about these things in a far-off land, right? It's not in a far-off land. I don't know if you followed this. In 2021, British Columbia, there was a heat wave killing 619 people, which is far more serious than the UK one because of the population difference, right? The ratio that's through the roof. Actually, an entire town, Lytton, BC, burned to the ground. You can look that up. And then that fall, there were floods. And what happens after you had they had all these forest fires because of the heat wave? The underbrush burnt away. The floods destroyed every road into Vancouver, which is the busiest port on the west coast. So yeah, this is the result of an irrational system that is not planned, that produces for profit, private profit. Now, what is the cause of this? I'm saying it's capitalism. What is the cause that the mainstream media says, or that mainstream politicians say? Well, I'd say it's ABC. It's anything but capitalism. It's boomers. It's plastic straws. It's your fault. You didn't buy a hybrid. You didn't recycle enough. They like blaming individuals and trying to make you feel guilty, right? But the ultimate reality is that we're relatively hopeless as individuals, faced with what is a massive crisis. And I believe this is therefore a systemic problem. It is a problem of the capitalist system that produces for profit with no regard for the environment. And I'd argue that it is impossible to solve under capitalism. Example of this, I'm old enough to remember the Kyoto Accords in the early 90s. The environment minister at the time, Stéphane Dion, named his dog Kyoto and then did nothing. Are we surprised that Justin Trudeau is basically just doing the same thing in a different way about everything? So they have these, they've had decades of knowing that there's a problem and having these big conferences about it, all the big world leaders, right? And setting targets that are in and of themselves almost meaningless, drops in the bucket, and then not adhering to those meaningless targets. Ironically, the greenhouse gases from these conferences is actually significant as they fly in thousands of people. So yeah, I would argue that this is inevitable. This is capitalism, and that the long-term existence of humanity is basically taking a back seat for the interests and profits of the big capitalists. Yeah, and again, this should not be surprising. As a Marxist, I would argue this is what is ultimately required, and it's not that complicated. This is it's a worldwide international crisis. You need planning. Now, I don't even blame the government so much, as horrible as they are, because ultimately, all the major decisions about pollution are not made by governments, mostly. They're made in the private sphere by private capitalists that decide to pollute because it's profitable. This is ultimately why socialism is the solution to this problem. I don't see how you're going to solve it without touching the private ownership of the means of production. We need to bring that under democratic control, under common ownership, right? You're not going to be able to solve it, ultimately. And again, that's capitalism for you. Now, one question I want to address here is this inevitable? I think that's a big one now. A lot of people think, yeah, well, it sucks, but what are you going to do about it? Isn't that just human nature? Aren't humans just greedy? We're killing each other. We're destroying the planet. That's just inevitable, isn't it? And I think many people have become kind of depressed because they've accepted somewhat that it's inevitable, right? I can sympathize with this, because why would you feel good about the future, especially if you're young? Wages are not going up, they're going down. You're probably not, I'm sorry if you thought that you're going to get out of university and have an amazing life, maybe you will, but I mean, the chances of that are actually much less likely than for previous generations. All of the statistical information is proven this, actually. But is this inevitable? Lots of arguments in the mainstream press, basically, and from mainstream academics and politicians claim that this is somehow part of our human nature, that we're just destined to destroy everything. Well, I am a Marxist, as I've already said, and I will argue that I don't believe that any of these horrible things are natural. I think they are just the inevitable result of the capitalist system, and a rational system that produces for private profit above all else. So then, what is the solution? I'll get on to the main topic tonight. What will socialism look like? So for many people, I think probably most people here, the fact that capitalism is a problem, I hope that nothing I've said is too controversial yet. The fact that capitalism is a problem is very clear. I think a lot of young people today know that capitalism sucks. I even meet right-wingers that agree with me that capitalism is not good because they can't really defend it so much anymore. But I would argue that it's easy to be against something. That's the easiest thing. It doesn't commit you to anything, actually. What's much harder, actually, but I would argue all the more necessary and actually worthwhile, is fighting for something. It's, of course, harder to articulate what you're fighting for than to just reject something that already exists, but we have to do that. We have to articulate what we're fighting for and how we're going to fight for it. So, Marxists, we do not, unfortunately, I wish we did, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't look into the future. And in this sense, we cannot, I'm sorry if you came here for an exact blueprint of exactly what the socialist future is going to look like. I can't tell you that. I think that's impossible. However, I think it is possible to make some deductions about what socialism will look like. In other words, we can make some hypothesis about the future based on evidence from the present and the past. And I actually think by looking at capitalism and the way that capitalism functions, we can see the potential for socialism. So socialism is not simply a revolution in the political sense. I know Bernie Sanders said political revolution against the billionaire class. But socialism is a revolution in the entire economy. It's a revolution in the entire way that we produce things, the way we live, the way education functions, being in a university, of course, the way we organize, the way we transport ourselves, the way we organize, the way cities are organized, I think even. And in many ways, we're not arguing, socialists aren't arguing for some master plan by technocrats from above. We're actually arguing to get the barriers out of the way for humanity, for the working class to discuss many ideas that actually already exist that will never be implemented. You probably heard of some of these things. I'll get into a few. So yeah, we're not some utopians that come up with a perfect plan that then ask everyone to sign on to. But yeah, I do think that there's many great ideas. I have some friends that are urban planners, and they go to school and they have big bright eyes, and they want all these. They have all these crazy ideas about how the city can be organized, the housing can be more equitable, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need to rely on oil and gas and stuff. And then their dreams are shattered as soon as they get into the industry, into government basically, because these things run contrary to the interests of capitalism. So in many ways, we're just trying to get those barriers out of the way to have that discussion. So just one basic concept that I think is important before you really get into anything about socialism. So socialism is about liberating hundreds of millions of people from drudgery. Not in some far-off land, although there is a very horrible condition. I mean, here in North America, here in Canada, there is millions of people that work crap jobs, increasing hours for low pay and can barely get by, and they don't have time or energy. Maybe some people in the room, I've worked service sector jobs before. It's very difficult. You don't have time to really think. You don't have energy to participate, right? So socialism is about liberating people, working class people. So wages, basic question. It's not a question of money. I think some people think, oh, but where are you going to get the money from? The things that I said at the beginning, the massive, incredible profits can more than enough fund good, livable wages for everybody, while lowering the work week and the work day. So you work less hours, right? That is more than possible. What happens under capitalism when they implement machinery to increase the efficiency? You you increase the efficiency of work. You can produce more for less labor. So that means the workers get to work less time. No, you get fired. Everyone knows that that's what happens, right? Under socialism, we change the logic. You increase the efficiency, you can lower the workday, you can liberate people to get educated, to be involved in the democracy, to be involved in producing art and culture and whatnot. So, like I said, it's not a question of money. There's literal mountains of wealth in our society, but the capitalists are like Smog the dragon, hoarding it, and they will fight against anybody that tries to touch that wealth. So I believe, again, this is only possible to address this question, this basic question of liberating hundreds of millions of people by tackling the question of capitalism. I already talked a bit about environmental destruction. Like I said, I think it's a consequence of the capitalist system. A couple examples. Everybody, I think most people know Bolsonaro in Brazil. He just was defeated, but he was in government. What did he do? He opened up large sectors of the Amazon for logging. Why? Why did he do that? Capitalism. That's what it was. This is private profit, right? Now, some people might say, oh, no, but he's just a right-winger. He's a Trump. He's crazy, whatever. You know, you could say what you want. Well, closer to home, the NDP government in British Columbia, are they Trumpites? I don't think so. They were elected on a promise of protecting old-growth forests. If you know British Columbia, I'm from the West Coast. I know it. They have these massive, amazing old-growth trees. They're huge. And, you know, when you cut them down, You don't get one back for hundreds of years. NDP was elected on a promise of protecting old growth forests. What'd they do? They betrayed on that. They opened it up because of the logging companies. Again, why did that happen? Is it because they're mean people? No, I would argue this is the logical conclusion of capitalism. So yes, oil production. Obviously, this is a very key question. We've known for a while that one, this is a limited resource, and two, it's not very good for the planet to burn oil and gas. And what happens? Absolutely nothing. Different laws, tariffs, taxes, limitate, all failed. And you still have, especially in a country like Canada, that has oil and gas as such a central part of the economy, running wild. And I believe, again, you need to nationalize the energy sector, take it under democratic control of the working class, so you could have a rational plan of how to transition away from that without a loss of jobs. That, I don't see how you're going to do that without a socialist solution, right? While protecting the private profit of the big oil bosses. You can't. The NDP in Alberta tried to do it and failed, actually, quite miserably. So the examples of well-meaning sort of left-wing governments that get in and try not to touch capitalism while solving these problems is not very good. That's why we are socialists. That's why I'm a socialist. Connected to this, I mentioned like socialism is not just a political revolution, but a revolution in a lot of aspects of life. One basic one, I think, is very pertinent for a city like Toronto. Transportation. Yeah, I just moved here a year and a half ago, and holy hell, this city, for a city of this size, it's rather incredible. And I know they just come out with a TTC budget. They're cutting service, which is incredible. And funding cops, because that's what we need, right? So yeah, socialism is a complete revolution in a lot of aspects of life. Now, quite often when you have this discussion, like socialists will say we need free public transportation, massively expanded, green, comfortable, higher quality, so that people don't need to drive cars and it's easier to get around, right? Because in terms of efficiency, if you want to talk about that, in a big city, most people are going the same places, right? So that is actually efficient for the whole of society. Now, quite often you have some smart aleck in the conversation that says, but who's going to pay for it? And I believe this is just a bourgeois prejudice. Why? Because if you look at public transportation, like the TTC, for example, as its separate company in society, and it runs free, well, yes, it runs at a loss. But for all of society, gets a bonus off of that. And you increase the efficiency and productivity and profitability of everything throughout all society because it's easier for everyone to get around. And also, if we want to talk about efficiency, look at the streets at any time. Is that efficient use of resources, transporting this number of people? I don't think so. You're transporting millions of people with millions of private automobiles. Now, I don't say we ban private cars. That's definitely a bad idea. But you massively fund public transportation systems to give people a good option. I think if you do that, 90% of people won't drive cars very much anymore. And then, again, that's connected to the question of the environmental crisis. You need to ask yourselves what impact that would have on the environmental crisis. But that, I believe, takes a socialist solution. It takes planning of the whole economy. Yes. Education. I mentioned education. Well, socialists, we believe that education should be free and should be lifelong, actually. Not this 4-year degree, get out, get a job, be a cog in the wheel type thing. The idea is to increase the knowledge of society and lower the ignorance of society. And that's actually good for everyone, right? So yes, a socialist program is a massive construction of universities, learning centers, whatnot, on many different things, and learn more stuff, right? You can learn more stuff. Free education from corporatization. I think you have this creeping corporatization in most universities around Canada, where they're determining the programs, right? They're pushing for cutting certain programs, privatizing university services, right? End academic paywalls. What's the point of producing knowledge if you put it behind a paywall that no one can access? These are all quite basic things. The money, again, this isn't a question of money. The federal government just spent $70 billion on fighter jets that I don't think we need, and I'd be willing to hear someone tell us we need them, because they said they're exclusively used basically for imperialism abroad, not for defense. Even if that was the case, I think that's nonsense. But yes, the money exists, like in corporate coffers, and even if the government decided to shift the money away from the fighter jets, it's more than affordable. But capitalism does not see a benefit in this because they must turn a profit, right? They want to privatize the universities. They want to privatize the education system. And that's what you see slowly happening. That's also why it's getting more expensive. Tuition goes up. The fees go up, right? And it's a slow road to privatization. You have the same situation happening in the healthcare system. So one of the results of what I'm describing, this liberation of hundreds of millions of people, reducing the working day, I think eliminating really hard labor, you can automate a lot of it. One of the results of this, I believe, would be a mass explosion of culture. And actually, if you think about the long view of history, capitalism actually produced an explosion in culture. Because compared with feudalism, capitalism was a huge advance. A massive advance, and you had a bigger layer of the population that was able to participate in culture and not just be working a million hours in agriculture, for example. So I think but socialism would be an advance on that, because you're liberating hundreds of millions of people to be involved in producing culture. There is a really good quote from evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who said, "I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops." I entirely agree with this. I think that there are geniuses that don't get to actually explore that potential in themselves because they're slaving away in a Starbucks somewhere or in a rice field or something, right? Or in a sweatshop of one way. And that's hundreds of millions of people around the world. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about liberating people so that they can actually participate in society. Free up human capacity to think and create. I know I'm a musician. I played in a number of bands. I played in a band with 3 other poor people. The difficulty in actually having not only the time, but the energy to even think to create art and culture and music it's inexplicable, really, ultimately. Can't Kanye West. I can't pay people millions of dollars to come to the studio and make a CD, right? But yeah, I believe socialism would also be, it's not just about economics and politics, it also lead to an explosion in culture. Now, you might say, what a utopian. This guy just told us a big fairy tale of a bunch of cool stuff, right? Well, how is this possible then? Is it possible? This is the question, should we have hope, actually? I think we should have hope. And I believe, actually, that there's an embryo of socialism in capitalism. And so there's 2 things, I would say. The first one's economic, and then the other one's kind of a social force to bring capitalism into being. So first on the economic precondition for socialism. So socialism is not some magic utopia invented in Marx's head. Our belief in a socialist future actually flows from our analysis of capitalism. And as I said, we can see this embryo of socialism within capitalism. Marx was in some ways a fan of capitalism, in a sense, because compared with feudalism, it massively developed the productive forces of humanity, right? And it's one of the reasons we're sitting in a massive university like this. For example, just some basic information. Using the United States. In 1900, there were 41% of the US workforce worked in agriculture. By 1930, that was down to 21.5%, and they actually produced more food. By 1945, that was down to 16%. By 1970, that was down to 4% of the US population workforce worked in agriculture, and again, producing more food. I don't even have the number today. It's probably even less. But in 2002, This was at 1.9% of the US population worked in agriculture and actually produced far more food than they did in 1900. What is this? This is progress. That's fantastic, because what you did, capitalism even in a certain way liberated these people from this. And so from a Marxist point of view, this is an economic precondition for socialism. It's the development of the productive forces which will allow us to liberate people, right, from labor ultimately. So this is what makes possible lowering the working week, lowering the working day, and liberating people from drudgery. Again, another economic factor. Some people think that the evil Marxists are all about centralizing things, concentrating things, but we need the free market. I'm sorry to tell you, the free market is mostly dead. It barely exists. The economy is dominated by a very small number of giant monopolies, like Walmart, Amazon, the major banks, etc. And internally, for example, Walmart has a bigger GDP than most countries, and internally, it is all planned. It is super planned, actually, down to the last detail. And actually, that proves what socialists say. We say planning is more efficient than the market. And in capitalism, most economic trends, most of the economy is actually planned in big conglomerates. And the market is actually a side thing now, I would argue. So yeah, as Marx explained, concentration is not caused by socialists. It's caused by the logical process of the capitalist system. And so we just say, well, if the economy is concentrated in a tiny minority of hands, like the Waltons who own Walmart, it's kind of feudal, it's one family, shouldn't the working class just take control of this and plan it democratically, this massive productive enterprise, the massive amount of wealth, so we can tackle all these problems that I've laid out here that we're all so well aware of? Again, this is how socialism can help solve the problem. Yes, moving on. I said there was the economic precondition, but then there's the social force. So it's not as though we think that socialism can be implemented by just walking around and convincing people one at a time. No. Like I said, Marx is not some utopian. We're not utopians. So how Marx described socialism coming into existence, or the force that could bring it into existence, was that he famously said in the Communist Manifesto, if you have not read, you must read it. We have copies over here. He said that what the bourgeoisie creates above all else is its own grave diggers. And what does he mean by that? Well, in capitalism, I described a lot of the negative stuff, right? But I'll describe something that's actually kind of positive. So we have the situation where the economy is dominated by a handful of monopolies at the top of the economy, and they control everything, all the major decisions in our lives, and they're increasingly controlling everything. If only there was a group of individuals that worked and knew how the economy functioned, because that's what they did on a daily basis, and also happened to be the vast majority of the population. If only that existed. Oh, it does. It's called the working class. That's what Marx talked about as the proletariat. So this is the social force that can bring socialism into existence. The idea of socialism has existed long before Marx. You could even say that the early Christians were somewhat socialistic, right? But what Marxism did, what Marx and Engels did in the main, was explain scientifically how a new system could come into being and what force would bring it into being. So I said, 1, the economic factors, the advanced productive forces, the concentration. 2, the proletariat, a new class, never seen before, that for the first time you had social labor, like we have. The whole economy and the whole world is all linked together, and we labor socially. And therefore, this also conditions how the working class struggles. Not because Marxists said, hey, workers, you need to struggle in a certain way, because it organically happens that workers struggle collectively. Workers form unions. Workers fight commonly together. They unite together. And actually, that's why Marx said the working class is the only class truly capable of developing a socialist consciousness. It is the natural conclusion of the working class struggle. And actually, don't believe me, you can start to see it. We are starting to see it happen today. Starbucks unionization drive in America. Amazon unionization. Who would have ever expected that? Actually, many people said this was impossible to unionize service sector employees like that. And here you have, I don't even know what the number is at. Last I checked, it was over 250 Starbucks unionized. And you have some spreading in Canada too. What is this except class, the working class becoming conscious of itself and fighting for its own interests collectively? Now, again, this doesn't mean that every worker is a flaming communist. I don't think so. But I believe this is the beginning of a process. I would argue the logical conclusion of this process of the proletariat, the working class, fighting against the bourgeoisie, this tiny minority of people at the top, the logical conclusion is socialism, is a democratically planned economy under control of the working class to fix the problems that we have laid out here. And I believe this is the most democratic system that has ever existed. It's not voting once every 4 years for a different group of white dudes in suits that make all the decisions. And actually, they don't even make all the decisions. A lot of decisions, as I said, occur in the private sector and in the corridors, right? So therefore, what the socialist program is, it's the expropriation of the big main companies, those big parasites actually at the top. In Canada, that's basically the top 150 companies. It's not very many companies. But that's the main lever of the economy. And putting this under democratic workers' control and instituting a socialist plan of production. And as I said, I think workers know far better than how to run the workplace and the industries than the bosses do. So yeah, I mean, I've been going on for a little while here. I have a few other things maybe can come in the discussion, but I think the future is hopeful. I know that might be a little controversial these days. I know a lot of people are hopeful because we tried the climate strike, we tried these giant BLM protests, we tried these strikes, we tried a lot of things and nothing changes. But again, why did nothing change? It's because if we don't articulate what we want, the capitalists always win at the end of the day. They find a way, right, to win. We have to fight for a different system, right, where the workers control society. So in terms of the future, I am hopeful, like I said. In my opinion, I think in the future people are going to look back at this period and think that this is a strange, barbaric period, actually. In the words of Einstein, who was a socialist, he said, the real purpose of socialism is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory stage of human development. And that is precisely what we're trying to do, actually. So I think people will look back at this time and be like, dear God, these people worked 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and they still didn't make enough to pay the rent and the bills? They destroyed the planet? They were going to war all the time with each other? Now, as I said, no socialist, I think, ever really wrote a book that was a perfect blueprint of how what socialism will look like. And I said no one exactly can say that, but I believe that it is clear that it is possible to lay the material basis to allow for a rational democratic planning of society, and that the working class and future generations will be posed with the challenges and the problems. And with private profit and private ownership of the means of production out of the way, I believe that there is quite unlimited possibilities for humanity. So it's possible, and I think it's worth us fighting for this. This is the most worthy cause, to fight for a harmonious development of industry and nature, and this is the most worthwhile struggle fighting for the victory of the working class in the coming revolutions. That the process that I have described of the capitalist crisis making everyone's lives worse is pushing this class, this massive class of people that just labor away, pushing them into political activity. If you don't believe me, you haven't been paying attention, because there is revolutions seemingly every few weeks or every month, every year in different countries, and I believe there is revolution coming to Canada, even in Canada. The conditions are going down. Eventually, it's like a pressure cooker. People will say enough is enough, and working class people will rise up. And it's up to us, socialists, to help articulate what the solution is to this problem and help our brothers and sisters in the working class to fight for victory, to fight for a socialist future for humanity. I'll leave it at that.